picture of the past flits by, the past can be seized only as an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. History is the almighty God of the beginning.
The historian must attempt to capture the sensations at the core of history's becoming, an image that passes as quickly as it emerges, what worlds we can bring into the present, a new time sense, one of disruptive celebration of a new historical memory. Revolution concerns itself with change to the entirety of ways of living because revolution itself is a state of living. The world was made and it can be changed. The future is being written. Revolution is the birth of your historical subjectivity, a climactic intensity that writes the future in blood and bone, lead and steel, and the violent encounter with past, present, and future. Revolution is an experience of the soul, a new line of flight and life form running up, over, and back through the social world that has not delivered on its promises. An organized politic of the pessimistic and hope without empty optimism, history brings the past to bear with the ruins of the present. Historical materialists, beware of the tropics of causality and determinism, lest we naturalize our contemptuous waking state. Take up the hammer, the tool that turns the street into stones and unleashes a wellspring of the new. Wake up! Pursue your aims! Nothing ever really begins. Everything is already here.
We're aware of tendencies to stabilize and concretize history into an arborescent stalk by which noteworthy moments of historical change are contained, in a way, encased in the root structure of reflections on events, ideas, history now regarded for its perceived consistencies and point of absolute clarity. The concerns of the historian are lost to the past, and the present is swallowed by a haunted image that draws you in only to devour you. Historical memory doesn't concretized form, but participates in a process of mutual distribution. In memory, forms become form via various ephemeral linkages. Historians should indeed examine premises and causalities, but revolutionary events and their connections are not entirely causal. Instead, history as rendered without the constraints of arborescence risks becoming new history. A series of condensations, reactions cast across an ever-evolving persistence that refuses to nail itself down to points of absolute origin. Knowledge of the meaning of history is a tipping of scales between past and present. A historical materialist cannot do without the notion of a present which is not a transition, but in which time stands still. We struggle so much to find the beginning of the new world. So be it. What do we experience when we dream? A night dream carries a lingering intoxication into our just waking state, but what of the sights and scents within our dreams? What of this presence that finds us just as we lose focus on the perpetual mundanity of the day-to-day, and instead begin to examine the accumulation of the day-to-day? The shared condition of the contemporary world is caught somewhere in this balance, which necessarily poses the question, what if it could be captured? What if we could sketch this image? What happens when its contours, colors, and shapes become real? Dreams are the past made present, and I awoke within the dream and realized it was all already here, waiting for its chance to emerge as history. A history of the present state of things. My dreams have redeemed the past. A true vision of history is the eternal promise of what is to come. Imagine such a singularity. Let's see. Yes, I've brought a passage. This is a speech that Eugene Debs gave in Butte, Montana on February 8th, 1897. Starts like this. The world is not right. Upon every hand there is evidence of cruelty. Men who work the hardest have the least, and men who work the least have all the wealth. Wall Street rules the American continent, and in some mysterious way it harnesses the American working man, and while living and fattening upon his earnings, compels him to pauperize himself. We're talking about revolution, and considering this kind of weird, almost mutant combination in our present moment of an inability to articulate a more compelling future that in some ways, like, negates or sublates our very difficult present, while at the same time, if we look around us, we see tensions being borne out all over the place. So I guess the question that it poses to us is, how do revolutions unfold, and how does revolutionary possibility sort of open up into our present and current moment?
The problem of like the revolutionary problem is like, what is it that we're even talking about in the very first place, right? So because so often in kind of like any sort of kind of political imagination, a revolution is the event, almost completely spontaneous. It's one decisive kind of that almost seems to come out of nowhere. What the problem that leaves you with is that you end up with this idea of the revolutionary being entirely not even spontaneous, but almost like messianic. The revolution has to come from outside. It has to sort of like appear in the temporal as this sort of eruption of like Benjaminian divine violence. And I don't think that is a helpful way of resolving the contradiction that you point out, which, is the symptom of capitalist realism, is the symptom of the kind of colossal low level of class consciousness, because people go, well, there won't ever be, like, a revolution is simply not possible. But it's like, how do you understand the present, and actually I think perhaps more importantly the past, as containing within it certain kinds of potentialities which have not yet been realized? Unsurprisingly, I'm going to say I think the block is very useful here, and the distinction Block makes between potentiality and latency. There are certain things which are potential possibilities within the current social, economic, political totality, right? There are certain things which, from the way that things are right now, we can extrapolate outwards, potentially for good, but often towards the very worst possible outcomes, right? But there are also latencies. There are things which are kind of buried remnants of dynamism that rests within the present, which are kind of ignored or obscured and not understood. And I think really the kind of problem is that people always begin looking for the origin point. Where did all of this kind of start? Where did, in any revolutionary moment, the point is always like, what was the trigger? But really, if you understand history is both fundamentally incomplete and riven with all of these latencies, it becomes almost impossible to kind of give a kind of neat historiography, right? You can't, it gets very messy very quickly, because really we're not talking about like an event. Like, if you accept Bloch's understanding of the philosophy of history, what you end up talking about is a kind of the spirit of utopia, right? This unextinguishable potentiality within the kind of within subjective ontology and within history itself as a drive towards something better. And I think it's perfectly reasonable, I think, for people to say that any kind of revolutionary change is not potentially possible, but that isn't the same thing as to say that the present has been completely foreclosed, right? A revolutionary future has been completely foreclosed, that all of the revolutionary latencies within the present have been kind of thoroughly excavated and extinguished.
It takes on this really important quality when these paradoxes in, history as a conception of human consciousness, while being fundamentally and totally incomplete, when it's placed within an historiography, becomes sort of unto the contingencies of that particular historiography, which is fine. But like, I think what, like, if the fidelity to the event can indeed produce some measure of cross-temporal, trans-temporal meaning, then we should continue to place these kind of concerns at the center of our sort of historical diagnostic process, right? If we're trying to figure out how revolutions unfold, you don't have to begin at any one place, but the only thing that you can't do is begin at one place. At the center, the fundamental paradox of our experiences is that if the event is producing surplus meaning by which, on the one hand, is governmentalizing or socializing systems of repression and allowing them to continue asserting themselves in a particular way, it can, on the other hand, perhaps give recognition to contingency's role in the expression of human agency, and that there's no way to take me out of revolutionary experiences, and that in fact what so often gives rise to the necessity for, or like the spillage of revolutionary potential in human consciousness, always comes from the things that should not resolve, right? The worker propaganda machine that seeks to create tiny little fucking cops in workers' heads to reinforce and reaffirm the sort of the top-down impulses of a productive apparatus. Despite all of this, there's a friction that emerges in the paradoxical experiences of work and capitalism, for example. Not all revolutions are, driven by a sort of a scare quotes worker, framework, right? That's pretty vulgar. To quote Frank Keeney, who was one of the chief belligerents in the West Virginia mine wars, he said this, quote, "Who made me a radical? I've seen the time when I didn't have the right to eat in this state. I've seen the time when I was refused a job. I've been served with eviction papers and thrown out of my house. I've seen women and children brutally treated in mining camps. And this important part, I've seen hell turned loose." Following with the sort of the theme of the passage that introduced our conversation today, there's a sense of a world that may always be wrong, or maybe the world wasn't made right.
And there's an example here that I want to add, which kind of fleshes out the distinction between what is latent within a present or within a history and what is potentially possible, right? So really the answer to that question of what is to be done for a lot of people is like, well, protest. Protest is a possibility, but protest is not revolutionary, right? And there's this article written by John Berger back in the mid-60s where he talks about protest and says this: "It would seem that the true function of demonstrations is not to convince the existing state authority to any significant degree. Such an aim is only a convenient rationalization. The truth is that mass demonstrations are rehearsals for revolution, not strategic or even tactical ones, but rehearsals of revolutionary awareness. The delay between the rehearsal and the real performance may be very long. Their quality, the intensity of rehearsed awareness, may, on different occasions, vary considerably. But any demonstration which lacks this element of rehearsal is better described as officially encouraged public spectacle. A demonstration, however much spontaneity it may contain, is a created event which arbitrarily separates itself from ordinary life. Its value is the result of its artificiality, for therein lies its prophetic possibility." Right? It's about the denaturalization of what is possible. Right? That, like, to have a sense of existence which understands not only is the world hellish, but as that quote ended, hell has been let loose, right? There is something that is deliberate. It isn't just a kind of given. It isn't just a certain kind of like this is the importance of that kind of like revolutionary history, because it underscores the extent to which demonstration and protest is the beginning of something. What it's the beginning of is kind of class consciousness, which is the ground of any what Berger calls revolutionary awareness. Without that, why would you care?
Why is there a stigma against the mob in the fucking first place, right? Like, why did they have to bake out, as we talked about in a previous video that you and I collaborated on, why did they have to feel the need to bake out the social role of like public groups outside of like the crowd had a role to play in politics, so I think was the words that we used. Now think about the role of the flash mob, one of the most fascist of American creations. the performative joy of a quote unquote spontaneous but planned, that felt so obscene as a one-for-one sort of replacement, like of such like an attempt to sort of like dance on the grave of insurrectionary politics. Like, these things became popular when I think I was an undergraduate, I believe is when I started seeing this kind of stuff appear online. And that was the end of the Bush years. What optimism does anyone have? Well, it's a capturing of public arrangement. It's a positive way to stigmatize, group behavior in public and to privatize the commons. Like, it's a flash mob is a privatization of that which historically has been something that was more common, which is not just a crowd's presence and assertions in politics, but the production of, light reference to friend of the show, E.P. Thompson here, this idea that it gives unique rise to the production of culture, and it is in many ways, if not a universal language by which working class people have created new ways for living, it is the language by which working class people have done that. It was born in common. And when everything is private, like everything is now, everything has been privatized, how do you reconcile? Everything has been privatized. The mob has been stigmatized just as much now as it has at basically any point in history. It is less acceptable now to be rowdy and in public.
The UK Conservative government passed a bill that said that protests that were disruptive are now illegal. What a great example of precisely what you're talking about, right? But the whole point of your question of well, what is to be done? It really, another way of phrasing that question is what are people capable of doing about it? And I think to bring it back to that problem that we started with, one way of answering that is we don't yet know what people are capable of doing about it, or rather, we have yet to remember what people are capable of doing about it. I mean, this is why we always insist upon the importance of understanding the fundamental incompleteness of history, right? Revolutionary activity is not simply about the creation of the future or a kind of break in the historiography of the present, but is about the retroactive redemption of the past.
Revolutions are about the reordering of space and time, history and architecture, remade in a moment of rupture. Revolutions are, in a way, about the reordering of the cosmos. When you look at the stars, what do you see? On a dark night, you see nothing up there, unable to peer beyond the veil of the atmosphere and light pollution, but life on this planet is dependent upon forces that we can't control on a cosmic scale. Waves, particles, dark matter. Look at the stars, and we're reminded of how small we are, drawn into a web of cosmic anxiety. It comes out in culture every so often, visions of disaster coming from somewhere out there. Life on Earth ended by asteroids or invaders. Georges Bataille built the idea of the accursed share out of the fact that the sun sends more energy to Earth than can be immediately absorbed by the creatures who live here. For Bataille, this energy has to be used up, consumed through sex and religion, or it will be spent on violence and war. Human society swings between chaos and order on the back of cosmic forces. History is made, in some ways, by the sun itself. The stars are a storehouse of myth. Monarchs used to cast horoscopes. Court astrologers peered upwards to work out the universal capacity of power and the blessing for their sovereigns. Dr. John Dee suggested the date of Elizabeth I's coronation based upon the movement in the stars, and first sparked the notion of the British Empire based upon ruling the waves through naval supremacy. Rumour has it that one of Dee's spells was behind the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Looking at the stars has always been a kind of political magic. When you look at the stars, what do you see now? For many, it seems space is an escape. They look at the stars and see a lifeboat. The Earth is not a shared or common treasury to these people, but something to strip bare and then launch into space through the power of their accumulated capital. Leave the poor to die in piles of plastic slurry under acid rain and take to the stars. Maybe look back at the pale blue dot, now made lifeless, bleached like bones in the desert. Elon Musk wants to take us to Mars, a red planet mirror of the world we have now. He launched a roadster up there a few years back. You remember that? You can drive cars up there now. That's the fantasy of space. For the billionaire, when they look at the stars, they see an opportunity. They see profit and dream of platinum mines on asteroids and indentured servitude for those who need to pay off their flights to get off this dying Earth. The stars are just like this planet we're on, and they'll be first up there to take it all away from us. They look at the stars and see nothing but what already exists. A blank canvas for the extraction of profit. 1 million possible worlds, all just like this one. When you look at the stars, what do you see? What would it mean to revolutionize our relationship to the stars? There is no coincidence that at moments of political revolution and instability, it involves a revolution in our conception of space and time. The philosopher Nikolai Fedorov died in 1903, little known outside of Russia, but he wrote of what he called the common task, the need through the Prometheanism of technology and the creation of new means of life so that all who died could be resurrected. It was an attempt to materialize Hegelianism, to not just synthesize all past epochs in the culmination of Geist, but to make that real. Resurrection was not metaphor, but for Fedorov meant the victory of the cosmos over chaos. A society that claimed the future must also necessarily redeem the past. And that was not just theoretical, but involved the communization of not just space, but time as well. As the biocosmist Immortalist Party wrote in 1922, we take the essential and real rights of man to be the right to exist, immortality, resurrection, rejuvenation, and the freedom to move in cosmic space, and not the supposed rights announced when the bourgeois revolution was declared in 1789. When they looked at the stars, what did they see? For this early moment of Soviet utopianism, space was possibility, the place in which all of the violence and pain and death of history could be redeemed. They looked at the stars and thought that humanity could not just be at the mercy of cosmic forces, but part of them. Walter Benjamin, in his 2-month visit to post-revolution Russia, wrote that the entire scheme of existence of the Western European intelligentsia is utterly impoverished in comparison to the countless constellations that offer themselves to an individual here in the space of a month. Look at the stars. What do you see? Some 20 years later, it was Benjamin that wrote of the great disaster of history, the storm that we called progress. All of those failures, all of those who have struggled and died and have been absorbed into the smooth teleology of unified history. The dead lie unquiet in their graves, and no radical politics should seek to silence them. For, as Benjamin put it, only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. The cosmists looked at the stars and saw the redemption of the dead, space for all who had suffered and died. Space and time would be mastered and reorganized under revolutionary consciousness. For the cosmists, the future was one in which the fundamental incompleteness of the past and the great tragedy of death could be done away with. The future would be the material fulfillment of that which has come before us, and to take to the stars meant not just making a copy of this world out there, but of remaking consciousness itself. To look at the stars was to look at the future. It was to see the very first outline of a world that has not yet come into being. And beyond the debris of Starlink and the drifting shell of Tesla Roadsters, it might still be there. When you look at the stars, what do you want to see?
It's incredibly important, I think, admirable opening up of the horizon of possibility exists somewhere in the acceptance that our moment has not yet been fully articulated. And like, if we can't accept that there's no alternative, we must accept that prehistory exists in our present moment. Even in the sort of like depths of mediated social contingency that we live in, we have to accept that the governing apparatuses of our contemporary moment perhaps have not fully articulated our moment, and that we have a way to speak for ourselves.
I mean, this is the entire point that Bloch makes, which is that it's a great quote that I always remember, and he says, as long as the present has not been completely foreclosed, right? As long as there is still the possibility of the new, right? Not even its actual presence, but just its possibility in some form, then he says, then no objection to utopia can be raised on purely factual grounds. You can't object on the grounds that the facts don't support it, because yet we don't, as you say, we don't yet fully know what all of the present is.
Right. I'm in the old world dying. I'm in the new world struggling to be born. I'm in the combination old world dying, new world struggling to be born. We're talking a lot about. I think what's good about the conversation around history is that it forcefully and necessarily comes back to questions of epistemology, where like we have to start. Like, we need an intellectual history of mob stigma for a reason. We need a revolutionary intellectual history for a reason, is because in order for us to using surplus energy to sort of like rip into the restrictions of the present in as non-representational means as possible is not just the beginning of something, but has always been the unfolding beginning of things. In various ways right now, and in very small, and our line of sight is very small, but we're always marching towards some kind of a horizon. And under those circumstances, well, nothing ever actually begins, as we've been referencing to.
The entire point about this mediation, about the increasing segmentation of capitalist production, is that it raises the question of criticality, right? Like, if COVID-19 has been anything, has been a lesson in where are the critical points in the globalized system of capital, and how is that influenced on the local and very micro level? right? This is it, like, I think the point that we're trying to get at, I suppose, is that obviously we could talk about issues of like revolutionary strategy or like the role and function of violence or insurrectionist all of that is kind of like a first order question. But the second order question is really the question of how does subjectivity and consciousness intersect with the revolutionary possibility of the present, right? And it's in moments like that when these kind of like when you begin to realize what you're capable of doing and the ways in which that capability exceeds the bounds of what you're told is quote unquote possible, that's when you start to kind of recover the basis of something like those interventions of critical power, right?
I think every opportunity that we've talked about today so far has all come from this kind of weird mutant combination of preparation and spontaneity that, of course, necessarily center on the production of meaningful subjective experiences. I don't know about the production of meaningful subjectivity. I don't know how to be a meaningful subject. But I do know that a revolutionary utterance is speaking in tongues, so to speak. It's born from a vocabulary, but seeks to use that vocabulary to push beyond itself, and that in that moment ideas and subjects become beyond themselves in some particular way, you know?
I think the best example of what you're talking about here is I was spending quite a lot this week rereading C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, and it's like, right, of all of the things that was not supposed to happen, right, there was not like was literally unthinkable, could not be thought. It was a successful revolutionary struggle in Haiti. And what's so interesting about what you just said is like, isn't this exactly what happens, right? Which is like, in a way, it's a revolutionary struggle that is a fulfillment and overcoming at the same time of the very situation that necessitated the revolutionary struggle in the first place, right? It's predicated on this idea of, you know, liberty, freedom, and brotherhood being a genuinely universal category that includes every single person, and it's like it's an incredible. If you've never read The Black Jacobins, you absolutely have to get hold of a copy. It's an incredible bit of revolutionary history, precisely in as much as it shows that this question of like what can the human do, or what can the human become, is still an open one.
Yeah, and it's amazing what someone can do when they're told over and over and over again that you are too black to be French. Enslaved peoples are teaching the French how to be better Frenchmen.
This is exactly why I kind of brought up the point of Haiti, which is like it's very easy to go the Haitian Revolution happened here, like in this discrete window of time, right? But actually, the Haitian the revolutionary struggles of Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture had predecessors, right? And they had predecessors in the sense of like not just in terms of insurrectionary movement, but in terms of the articulation of a kind of consciousness that did not yet find full expression. And quite arguably, the revolutionary moment has persisted on way after the death of Toussaint Louverture. Yeah. Like, as you pointed out, even up into the present day, right? And there's another quote here from it's actually from the introduction to Ernst Bloch's book Atheism and Christianity. It's written by the Bloch scholar Peter Thompson, who says, Bloch is indeed asking us to immanentize the eschaton, to force the point at which the old gives way to the new, regardless of whether it is considered to be the right point in time or space, and regardless of the prospects of its outcomes. Revolutions can never come too early in that sense, for if they fail, then the failure contributes to the next success. All revolutions are glorious until they fail, and all revolutions must fail until the very final one.
The world isn't right That's the sort of promise of our project, is that, yeah, the thing that you feel is wrong is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we said this in the very first episode, right? Like, that feeling that you have, like, no, no, you're not crazy. Like, it's real, it's true. You are correct to feel that, and to understand each failure of the revolution of any revolutionary struggle is simply providing the ground from which the next revolution emerges. Means that, like, it's very easy to think of kind of leftist approaches to revolutionary history as being inherently defeatist, but to be a leftist and to think about revolution is always to be looking in two directions simultaneously, right? It's looking at I really like the word that you use of being catalytic, right? It's about looking at the embers of the last flame, and understanding that as the kind of sparks of the next thing that is, in essence, already in existence, even if right now it can't be seen everywhere.
There's a, and even if it can't be seen everywhere right now, even if it can't be seen at all, the radical promise of revolutionary possibility is truly about sort of like wading into the water and waiting for the sky to tear open and for the premillennialist sort of like reign of Christ to begin, which has always been, for better or worse, a recognition of the dearth of our moment, of a sort of a persistent absence that's waiting to be filled and resolved, changed, fixed. And that the problem of our contemporary moment is that the future is no future. It's not that there isn't a future, it's that there is one that isn't. And it's in these self-negating sort of, it's a vacuum that constantly collapses in on itself, and that gives no recognition, gives no rise to the role of expression of agency and contingency, and rather necessitates expression within that contingency, which is that's the flash mob mentality. The role of the expression of human agency is always in the expression of contingency, not expression within contingency. Because, like, okay, we want to use violence. What makes violence revolutionary? What makes a particular kind of violence a revolutionary kind of violence? In 1877 in the United States, there was an uprising across thousands of miles of rail line that spurned off into these sort of individual isolated conflicts within various communities that immediately saw the factionalization of various groups, and mobs form up and people start committing acts of violence against one another. And what was the catalyzing event? Well, we can say that the catalyzing event was a railroad strike in West Virginia that began in West Virginia and that moved to Western Pennsylvania and that spread across the United States via ever extending amount of railway that was being installed after the Industrial Revolution here. But that's not that simple. Always within our moment is the next moment, and all previous moments within our moment as well. I'm at the old world dying. I'm at the new world struggling to be born. So we have to, like, it means that doing the work of birthing the new world does mean tearing up the old one in a way to try and sort of like bring, to give rise to something new. And sometimes that means doing the work of revolutionary violence. Sometimes that means doing the work of uprising and insurrection. Sometimes that means taking into sort of responsibility the defense of the commons, which means standing in defense with people in your community. This isn't lone wolf violence. It's convenient that this form of political thinking does away with that bullshit right-wing nonsense. If you cannot save your world, you cannot save the world. It is never going to just be about you, right? But it is at the same time. The idea that something that's not about me can feel so personal says everything that I need it to say about what kind of world I want to live in, you know?
A world which is not yours. It's a world, like, it's the kind of the kind of practicalities of revolutionary struggle are worked out in the process of it itself, right? Bloch always said that the people will be made by the process that makes the people.
Right.
Revolutionary practice is an unfolding, consistent process of becoming. Right? There is no set formula or way of doing this, and it is about the abnegation of what is your world supposed to be. The question, that's not really the question. The question is, what might our collective new world come into being and look like?
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.